Australia's top regulator has a new boss and he's a banker, not a lawyer. Greg Medcraft has created 3 new banners for ASIC. Investors informed and confident, fair and efficient markets, and also fair and efficient licensing and registration systems. And alongside these banners are some interesting new ideas. In his first major television interview, Chief Greg Medcraft spoke to me earlier. Greg Medcraft, welcome to the programme.
Thanks, Tiki.
Now, you say you're going to be as tough as Tony D'Aloisio. You're still going to take on the big cases and deliver for small business. So my first question is, how with the budget cuts? I mean, you've got cuts now to 57 frontline investigators, or from your enforcement team, of more than 200 cuts. How are you going to do it?
Well, Tiki, my view is that, you know, we actually have to optimise the resources that were allocated by government. We actually start with engagement with the stakeholder groups. You know, we've got our surveillance that we do. There's the guidance we issue in the market. There's the education we do throughout the market. And then there's what we do in deterrence. And also, if things are really not working, we give it policy advice. So they're all, you know, deterrence, for example, remains a cornerstone in what we do, but it's not the only tool we have to actually achieve our outcomes. So
now, you say you've got a big focus on gatekeepers, directors, product manufacturers, rating agencies, but also advisors and lawyers and auditors. Now, as an ex-banker yourself, you would know what very private worlds they are. How are you going to keep track of them and hold them to account?
Well, you know, you're quite right. I'm glad you actually focused on gatekeepers. You know, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of achieving the outcome, which is that investors and financial consumers are actually confident and informed, gatekeepers, are actually absolutely critical to that. What we're focused on with and particularly, say, investment bankers, the investment banks, we're really focused on them as product manufacturers. And in fact, when we undertake surveillance on the investment banks, we really focus on their new product approval procedures in terms of how they're bringing a product to market, to make sure that, you know, they are focused on making sure that the products they're actually bringing to market are not inappropriate for particularly for retail investors.
Now, very interestingly, the other thing you're doing is considering releasing more public information about investigations. You've said we're sometimes very frustrated that we can't tell the media about the bad things we're investigating. I investigated 2 of the big hits you've had over the last 4 years, Multiplex and West Point. I couldn't get anywhere near anyone at ASIC to talk about these things. I was simply warned about contacting whistleblowers. The only time I got any feedback was when I knew that you indeed used both those Four Corners pieces to actually help you secure your outcome. So I got feedback then. But how are you going to change that?
Well, as I've outlined I think in the Senate estimates, in relation to investigation, I think the first thing is that we have to actually explain to everyone why, in fact, we won't release information about investigations. I think it's important to remind people, you know, what's behind the policy we have in relation to investigations. The second thing is that I have actually asked if we can see what we can do in terms of disclosing more about what we're doing in investigations, and while at the same time respecting, what we have to do within the law. But there's a third aspect to this which I think I want to explore a lot more, which is I think we could do, perhaps we should spend a bit more time, particularly with the media, explaining the sectors that we're undertaking surveillance on, which is, you know, where are we concerned about high risk in particular sectors.
And also big companies that are being investigated with a lot of public interest, like, for example, ABC Learning, and a lot of these big companies where the issue becomes trading while insolvent. Another question I had for you is would you look at surveillance on liquidators, tapping phones of liquidators, because it's very difficult to prove this, isn't it, trading while insolvent?
With the liquidators, we actually already have a surveillance program in place, and what, again, to my point, is that I think on that program probably what we need to do is actually be communicating more effectively what we're doing in terms of the surveillance of that particular sector.
I want to ask another question about compromises that you do on some of your big hits. Let me give you an example of Multiplex. Now, that was a fine in the end for the company, which shareholders ended up having to pay, when in fact the people at fault were actually the board. Do you find that some of the compromises that the regulator ends up imposing really don't hit the right people?
Look, I think in terms of what we do in deterrence, it really is an issue of looking at the, in terms of the resources we spend in terms of the outcomes we're looking to achieve. My view is that you've always got to look at what outcome are we looking at in terms of the community, which is, if you're back into something like the retail area, it's always that judgment of saying, well, how much resource do we spend in one particular deterrence action to actually get an efficient outcome? And, it's always sometimes debatable in terms of, whether that was the heaviest or the most appropriate use of resources.
Finally, just one on small business. Now, ASIC says it knows what small business wants: less red tape, more stuff online, and someone who will listen to them. What are you actually going to do about it?
Look, with small business, I guess my view about small business is that often they're fragmented, they're often not empowered. They're in many respects a lot like individual consumers. So I think you've got to recognise that. And what I've actually asked to be done is to look at where we touch significantly small business and actually look at where there are issues in relation to small business, and then what perhaps we could do better to deal with the issues of small business.
Greg Medcraft, we wish you lots of luck in the job. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Tiki, thanks for having me.